we're going to be looking at Azure from a very high level. So we're not going to be going to the portal, and we're not going to be talking about products specific in Azure. Like we're not going to talk about Cosmos DB specifically or any performance tuning or anything like that. We're going to be looking at the organization and structure of how you should be setting up Azure for either your enterprise or for your application, specifically networking, management groups, and those items. So I just want to let you know that, if this wasn't what you were looking for, I wanted to let you know that before we got started. And again, this is Azure for the Enterprise. If you were looking for another talk, you are in the wrong room. So my name is Jared Rhodes. I am a principal at EPAM Systems in the cloud delivery, America's Cloud Delivery Division. No one in the Southeast knows what EPAM is. They are a giant publicly traded consulting firm with like 80,000 employees, but no one down here really knows who they are because they don't interact with them. I am a Microsoft MVP. They changed the categories this year, so I was Azure. Now I'm Internet of Things. I don't know how, but I still say I'm MVP for Azure because that's primarily what I talk about. Now I'll have to update this slide eventually. And mainly what I do for work is I join Teams meetings. I have a little calendar, it pops up every once in a while and it says join, and I just click join, and usually I sit in silence until someone has a specific question. In this talk, first, we're going to talk about landing zones and what landing zones are in Azure. And then we're going to talk about shared resources within Azure. Most of the information for this talk is from the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework and the Well-Architected Framework. I'm mainly pulling a lot of slides and content from there. This is something that Microsoft has invested heavily in. They have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of documentation. And internally, they're still working all the time to update and expand on this information so that when it's your turn to go ahead and set up an Azure environment, you don't really have to go in and think of it all yourself. They have blueprints, Terraform scripts, Bicep scripts, all of different varying sizes to get started. So let's talk about landing zones. One thing I didn't do that I should have done, and this will be my first time giving this particular talk, so sometimes I'm just going to stop on a slide and go, I should have put something here for this. Let's talk about scenarios that I run into for clients in actually setting these up. One, a company just signed their enterprise agreement with Microsoft, and when you sign those enterprise agreements, you have minimum spend. What that means is you sign a 5-year agreement, they'll pay millions of dollars to get you into Azure, but you also have to spend $5 million your first year and $10 million your second year. So whenever the initial agreement gets signed, sometimes customers come to us and they're like, hey, I got to figure out how to spend $5 million this year. I've got a data center loaded with applications. Let's move those to Azure so that I don't have to spend. And then Microsoft comes in and will pay for a large portion of that migration. So that's one. Another way we get clients is they're in step 2 of that. Hey, I tried to do that and we made a lot of mistakes, and we kind of need you to come in because we're nowhere near our minimum spend, and we need you to go ahead and fix this for us. Or finally, you get lucky and you get really lucky, and they're saying, hey, we did it, we set up everything right, we just need to start modernizing, we moved all our VMs over, but now we'd like to use some cloud native stuff. That never really happens. By the time they get to that phase, no one wants to outsource that work, everyone internally wants to do it. So mainly we get 1 and 2. Talking about landing zones, we're going to break it down and talk about the components that make up landing zones, and then we'll talk about the organizational structure of those landing zones. So landing zones, Microsoft defines them as Azure landing zones are the output of a multi-subscription Azure environment that accounts for scale, security governance, networking, and identity. So the components. This is going to be the Microsoft, and it's been this picture for years. I'll show the full picture at the end, but this is how they try to show the individual landing zone. So this blue box, even though they say this is the landing zone subscription, it's not really. There's another blue box in it, and it's kind of confusing. So this isn't your subscription per se. This is everything around your subscription for your landing zone. So you have your IAM, so you've got your identity and access management. These are going to be the roles and access rights that are assigned to your subscription coming from Azure Active Directory. It's going to have policies applied to it. Policies allow for you to act on metadata and the life cycle of resources. The simplest one to explain is you can have a policy that says no public IP addresses. That's something that a lot of companies like, because if people go around making public IP addresses, it leaves a huge surface area for attack. So you can just have one that says no IP addresses, or you can have one that says no IP addresses, but let them do it, but let it show up in my audit report later. And then finally, you need your management and monitoring. You guys know what that means. I got to be able to see what happened. I got to be alerted when bad things go on. If my website goes down, I need health monitoring and alerts, that kind of stuff. Also shared is going to be my shared services. Anything corporate-wide that I'm having to use that some other team is managing, I'm going to have, in this example, Active Directory, or any other number of services that I need to use that is not controlled within my subscription. And then finally, you're going to need networking, because you're not going to have a lot of people who get started with the cloud from a developer's perspective. They go in and they have the ability to create a SQL Server instance with a public IP address and a DNS name and a firewall that they can just add their IP address to. That's not how it works when you get to production. So networking, you're going to have to really think about what our private link, what our VNets look like, and those will most likely be outside of the subscription that your application is in part. And then we still have other aspects where I've got cost management, my monitoring, my network watching, my Microsoft Defender for the cloud. And all of that wasn't even in your landing zone. All of that was shared resources, either managed by Microsoft or something internally that you were running. Now we're finally in your subscription where your actual application is. And even within that subscription, you're still going to have whatever you need to run your application, and internal to that, what are the access rights to those things within my application? How do I access the database? How do I handle my secrets, keys, and how do I monitor my actual application? So that is your basic landing zone. Are there any questions about the basic landing zone? All right. So you have networking, you've got your identity, you have your governance that you need to have on there, like policies. You have security concerns that need to be applied. You need to be able to monitor it. And then finally, you're probably going to have some backup DR, high availability, also built into your application. We are looking at the Microsoft guidance. So this is a quote. Microsoft guidance focuses on using Microsoft products. That's my quote, because that's really what they do, right? They didn't spend all this money coming up with a way to tell you how to use Azure and not throw in Azure Monitor and then Application Insights. That's not how it actually works in the enterprise. As much as I would love to be able to just use their blueprints and pull everything in, actual enterprises have millions of different third-party products that have to be used across all these different things because they need to log a certain way. In fact, it really falls into two buckets. You're a startup and you don't need everything that the Microsoft product offers and it's too expensive. Or you're an enterprise and you need more than they have and you need something completely bespoke to your company. And so when we do landing zone sales internally, I have an entire adapted version of the Microsoft landing zones that just have all kinds of other company products scattered throughout it, because that's the reality of what your end product looks like. Okay, so let's talk about what you're going to think about when you're thinking of networking, when you're building your landing zone. So you need to think about the entire network topology, and you think about this in two levels. One would be the infrastructure level, and one will be the actual application level. At the infrastructure level, what I mean by that is how does our entire corporate network work? What blocks are assigned to what business units and application teams? And at the application level, you're thinking, what blocks are allowed for my data? What blocks are allowed for my front end? What blocks are allowed for my caching layer? So you need to think about the topology. You need to think about the connectivity. So if I need to connect back to the larger network to use some third-party service that's supplied by some other part of the company, or I need to have a firewall rule so that I can reach out to a public endpoint for a SaaS product that's not in the cloud, you have to think about that. And then finally, security. Every company I've worked at where we have to do cloud migrations has a very long and arduous process of getting security sign-off on anything that goes in and out of the cloud, and most of that has to do with the attack surface of the network. For identity, you need to think about it in, I guess, two major ways, because there's two major types of identity that you run into in Azure. One is platform access. So I call it the central management for those shared resources. That's your rights when you go into the portal. What can you do when you actually access the Microsoft portal or you're using the CLI or whatever? That's the infrastructure access or the central management for your shared resources, where you're actually thinking about the access to Azure itself. And then there's the application resources. So I created that database. What does my access to the actual database look like? What is my access to my admin portal of the app that we created? That kind of stuff. And for both of those, I just want to throw out there that you can create customized roles. So in Azure Active Directory, you create the groups. Within those groups, you assign access rights to different components within Azure or to your applications, and then you add users to those groups. That's a little bit outside of this talk, but just remember that you can create these roles within Active Directory, assign rights to them, and then add and remove members from that group and make your life so much simpler, because if somebody quits, you've already got a system in place to just pop them out of Azure Directory instead of having them float around in there, having access to your development environment 10 years down the road, which I still have access rights to tons of development environments like 5 or 6 years down the road after I left a contract, just because they didn't have that set up properly. For governance, you need to think about cost management. We all work for a company, we spend money, the company wants to know how we spent that money and who and what business unit that gets assigned to. So for cost management, you have to think of it in 2 ways. Think of it as in making sure that you don't spend too much. You didn't have someone on your team turn on that 4 GPU instance of a machine learning VM and leave it on all night, and somehow you wake up to emails about your $3,000 bill. So that's 1. And then 2 is actually getting the reports of that $3,000 bill back to the right part of your system so that they can see what cost center that went to. You need to set up a security baseline. When we talk about policies, which I have a follow-up to this talk that we're not going to be able to do here, but I go more into policies and initiatives on how you propagate these baselines. But you need a security baseline. You need a security baseline, and I'll say it again, you need a security baseline. Most of my job ends up in meetings with security to get security to approve things so that you can have the same thing 10 different times, whereas if you have policy or initiative set up for a security baseline, you can get it approved once, have it propagated through the whole system, and not have to meet with security for everything that you need. Same thing applies to resource consistency. So if I have, 1,000 applications running SQL Server, I want to know that I have a baseline consistent a baseline consistent resource for SQL Server that I know it's applying, SSL, or it's applying whatever other thing happens in SQL Server that we want to make sure happens across the organization. And then once the applications team have access to it, they can add more. But we want that consistency to have that baseline across our resources as well. And the same thing goes for identity. We want to know if I've had customers with 500 plus subscriptions. I want to be able to go in and look and have an understanding of what the identity assignments are within that subscription without having to figure out what their scheme was for their identity management. So I want some sort of baseline there as well. And then finally, we want to get it to where everything is set up so that DevOps can now do this. So you can create all of these policies as code using Terraform or Bicep or whatever, and you can create all of that as part of your DevOps pipeline. So now when I need to create a new environment for a team with the right policies and the right identities, it's just a DevOps script like everything else. For security, you need to consider, how do I alert? Because I want the security team to feel the kind of pain that they put me through. I want security logs so that I can do a retro on whenever there's an incident. Security controls so that we can change what is and is not allowed depending on business unit needs or management group needs. I need to be able to manage those vulnerabilities. I have to make sure that there's a shared responsibility between the security team and the application teams so that things are not solely within one group. And then finally, I need to make sure that encryption and keys and all are managed in a common way that is pre-approved by the security teams. For monitoring, I need to be able to monitor my application health, my user experience. So I need to be able to monitor, page load times. I need to be able to monitor database transaction times. I need to make sure that I can monitor those security logs and other items I talked about, monitor my alerts, make sure that my monitoring is actually useful. I had a client that moved a bunch of VMs to Azure, turned on application insights, and Microsoft was just giving them the thumbs up the whole way. And then their central application insights was burning $30,000 a month just because they were monitoring and pulling in everything. And they don't tell you, Microsoft, when they do the thing, they don't tell you how expensive it's going to be at the end. And they tell you got to monitor everything, you need to pull in all your logs, and that is not exactly true. And you definitely don't need to hold them in application insights. So make sure that your monitoring is actually useful and that it actually can provide value instead of just providing terabytes of storage. You need to make sure that your entire life cycle is integrated, from your CMDB to your DevOps pipeline, everything. They all have to be monitored. Otherwise, when there's an incident, you won't be able to do a proper retrospective. And then the same thing for your identity and access management. And for infrastructure identity access management, Azure has hooks so that you can just say log to this sync. So whenever someone changes anything within your groups or changes anything like creating a resource or changing properties, all of that can be logged as well. I've done enough migrations that when I was putting this together, I wanted to put this slide about monitoring. When you're doing a migration from cloud to cloud or private cloud to public cloud, none of the monitoring is in place for you, at least from an Azure perspective, and you can take it in steps. So first, you'll probably try to figure out how to do IaaS monitoring, and then you'll get into where you can do your PaaS monitoring, and then finally, you can get your entire stack monitored by whatever vendor. This is a Microsoft diagram, so obviously you would get it monitored by Microsoft. And then you finally need to be resilient. You need to make sure that you have proper backups, that you have a disaster recovery plan, and that you have high availability. And then you need to have for each of those an actual test instead of just having backups that are never tested. You need to actually make sure that these work. Okay, so that was all of the components of what you need to think about when you're starting to design your landing zones and your Azure policies and initiatives. Are there any questions so far? All right. So this is the even larger landing zone picture from Microsoft, where we have our management groups, our different types of landing zones, our DevOps pipeline, all in one picture. And so let's break down what this actually is and how you can use it. Okay, so first, we got our management groups and subscriptions. So right here is the tenant root. All right, so this is the part I'm not 100% clear on, but I think when you sign that enterprise agreement, or I know for my personal accounts, there's a tenant root that everything will come off of the tenant root. So if you're Beehive, and then you'll have like beehive.com will be your tenant root. And then off of that, you'll start breaking it out by business units. So Beehive has, I don't know, I really don't know. For a lot of our customers, it's like the financial units, the manufacturing units, the retail units, whatever. Those get broken down into this right here. And that's something I want to kind of focus on for a second, because that's what threw me off in my first couple of major organizational setups, is that tenant root doesn't really have anything. Like it doesn't have to have any initiatives, policies. It will have your baseline initiatives. And then when you actually get to your business units, that's where you have your initiatives and policies so they can properly propagate down to what that unit needs, because everyone will be different. Once you have the business unit, then you're going to break it out into platform. So the platform is going to be the shared resources across what all of our business unit is going to use. So if we have specifics for logging, or if we have specifics for alerts or management systems, whatever, that is going to be under our platform management groups. And then our landing zones is what we talked about in that first picture. That's where our actual applications are going to live. And finally, you've got decommissioned. You're going to have decommission, because when you delete a subscription, it has 30 days before it truly deletes, and it's going to be sitting in limbo. So you just have to have that. Otherwise, you're going to have this weird graveyard of subscriptions hanging off your whatever other. And when you do that, the policies still get applied downstream, and it can cause some weirdness where you're paying for things you don't want to pay for. So you got to have that decommissioned one. And then finally, what is the actual holy grail of all of this is the sandbox subscriptions, in my opinion, because 99% of what customers get sold on is we want to empower our developers. And they get put here or somewhere else where they have no rights and they still have to go through all the processes. What you really want to be able to do is give them a sandbox subscriptions so that they can test things out that aren't connected back to the wider network and try to figure out how to create things. Go ahead.
Can you move subscriptions underneath the new management group?
Mm-hmm. You can. Yeah, you can move them around management groups. When you do that and they move, the new set of policies get applied. And if they are in a separate state, it'll just get really mad at you, right? If they had a bunch of public IP addresses and then you move them to one that says no public IP addresses, it'll just break stuff. But you can move them. However, also continuing on that, I usually, depending on what state it's in, we'll delete it and create a new one, right? Because instead of having to figure out what was in the other one, if we had infrastructure as code, it's not as much of a fight.
So are we to revert policies?
Is there a way to revert policies? You can always change the policy back. So the normal workflow for policies is create whatever rule I want to apply, set that rule to audit instead of deny, and then check and see how much damage I'm about to cause if I'm going to set it to deny, and then remediate, and then set to deny. Okay, so first we're going to look at, actually I think first we're going to look at what is part of your infrastructure that is not held within your landing zone hierarchy. Then we're going to look at the platforms, we're going to talk about the actual landing zone, and then we'll take a quick look at DevOps pipeline. So what Microsoft has up here really has to do with how your enterprise handles identity and access management. So first has to do with your enterprise enrollment. How do access rights for the actual application work? So how do I allow access to my website if it's coming from Azure Active Directory? And you can change this out for whatever access, Okta or whatever else that your company uses for access to applications. And then you've got your infrastructure. So I say infrastructure, the identity and access management here, and this is what trips a lot of people up, is both, right? It can handle access to the portal or to the CLI or however you want to think of the Azure platform, and it can also manage how you access your actual applications. But really for this is just the Azure Active Directory stuff, and this is how you get your approval workflows, your notifications, multi-factor authentication. And this is, I don't like how these are separated, but it's really these two together where you're thinking about how does DevOps deployment pipeline access my subscription to create the key vault? How does my user access the website internally using their Azure Active Directory credentials? So it's to me, these two are much closer together. And then if you get lucky and you got a giant organization that has their own LDAP Active Directory, you can also worry about synchronizing different identity providers back into Active Directory to propagate down to Azure or other services. One of the big ones they break out is the identity subscription. And in their guide, you'll notice that there's like nothing. Like they're just like, maybe you've got servers. And the reason for that is in Microsoft world, well, you're just going to use Azure Active Directory. You don't need anything else. So it's empty. But in the real world, you're going to want this because that's never how it works in whatever enterprise you're in. You're probably going to have some sort of identity-based workload. And you want to do it to the subscription. And something I probably have really missed out on up to this point is why are we breaking everything down into these individual subscriptions? And one of the biggest reasons is the identity and access management of whatever's in the subscription. You don't want everyone to have access to the identity resources. You want a very select few people to have access to identity, so we create this subscription so that when we have access to the platform, it's scoped to just the people who need identity access. So that's your identity subscription, and you would know what goes there for your application. I'm just checking time. Then you can have a management subscription. So whatever your company uses for management. Again, for Microsoft, it's all log analytics, but if you use Elk, whatever, for your logging, if you use SolarWinds, whatever, that goes into your management subscription or your management landing zone for that, again, identity and access scoping so that only so many people have access to take a look at those logs or set those alerts or whatever. And then you got your connectivity subscription. Another thing, and I might have to go back. All right. When we talked about the scope here, about you having the business unit starting right there, that doesn't have to be just the business unit. That could also be your application team, and it could be sitting under. So if this is finance and you're in finance, you could also have one right there beneath this that is your teams, right? So the reason I say that is when we look at networking, when Microsoft has this diagram, they're sort of showing you this from a, I'm the central management team, so I'm controlling the express route or the cross-cloud connectivity. You're going to want this also if it's even scoped to your team, because you're going to have this VNet within there. So if it's the shared infrastructure, like the corporate-wide data center infrastructure, you're going to have your firewall, your express route, or your VPN, or all of the above there. If you're doing it for your team, you're not going to have all that. It's going to be propagated to you from the shared infrastructure group. You're just going to be using their firewall. But what you will want is one that has your VNet with your address block in it, and it's going to peer back to the shared network. And the reason you want that is because every time you peer a network in Azure, you have to get approval from whoever has access to the other side of that network. And if you don't create this, that means every time someone has to create a landing zone with a VNet in it, they're going to have to request that the shared infrastructure team grant that, as opposed to creating a VNet that you can peer once, and then now you control every peer that goes to it. So you're going to want that. And here you can also set up things if you have your own DNS or you need your own network watchers because you're a large team, stuff like that. Now, we've talked about everything except your actual application. Now we're finally to the landing zone where your applications go. So the actual landing zones where you build your application is where you start thinking about your environments. So we're now at the solution level. So start thinking about how I set up dev, QA, prod. Everything that goes into my actual application should live within this landing zone subscription. And I say this landing zone subscription, you all know your solutions, obviously. You could have many landing zone subscriptions depending on how large your team is, how the product's separated, that kind of stuff. But once you get past the shared infrastructure, now you're starting to look at building out the landing zone subscriptions. And you're doing that per environment. And again, this is a scoping to access rights. Now I can have it to where I have my dev environment that looks exactly like my prod environment, but the subscription has different access rights. So now I can make it to where the dev team can look at all the logs and they don't have to be scrubbed and they can look at the database, connect directly, whereas in my production environment, which is the exact same as this, just has different access rights to those resources.
And would you recommend using a subscription over resource groups for environments?
Yes, and a couple of reasons. One is when you hit at scale, and I know I hate saying that. When your team gets really large is a better way to say it, or your environment gets large, there can be problems with resource groups from a management perspective, as Azure thinks of it from a subscription standpoint when it starts doing aggregates. Another thing that can happen, though, that is really dumb and has hit me a couple of times from clients who set up the single subscription and resource group, some products like Network Watcher or Kubernetes will create auto-generated resource groups that you have no control over. You don't get to name it, it just creates automatically when you create it. And when you have a large organization, two people want their own network watchers and there's a collision and now you're stuck trying to get out of that particular hell of a situation. And now you have to start breaking up subscriptions and then everyone's like, well, I want my subscription. We actually have a large retailer that is going through that right now, and it's been 2 years, and they still haven't gotten out of this resource group in a single subscription.
Are there limits to like how much VM you could put in a resource group, or is that only at the subscription level?
I can't tell you off the top of my head if I know there's limits. You can actually go look it up. There are limits. And I do think that subscription has a larger limit than resource groups. I can't tell you. I don't want to say yes because I'm not 100% sure. But there are limits. There's also hidden limits. We had a customer one time that was a large auditing firm that tried to turn on 10,000 virtual machines at one time. Apparently, Azure thinks that's an attack and will not let you do it unless you call your rep and get them to approve it. But yes, there are limits to the resource groups. Any other questions? All right. And then you got what I thought was the Holy Grail. Actually, you know, the thing that gets sold of empowering you to actually try the new products or whatever, your sandbox. You just don't, in a lot of cases, you just don't peer it back to the corporate network. You don't allow it on that network, and you can have less restrictive rules about what can be put in there. And so it allows people to test and have a playground to do stuff. And you can, if you set it up right, you can create these pretty much just click a button for the development team and they can just create one and go wild. But make sure you got your cost controls set up properly, because sometimes people like to try stuff out and they don't pay for it and it gets really expensive and that turns into a set of meetings. And then you got your DevOps, which I don't know when they're going to update this from the Azure DevOps to GitHub Actions, but they will. They will, from the way they're hiring or were hiring and the way that they've invested. Rumor has it that Azure DevOps has, I don't want to get in trouble. Rumor has it, so I don't know this, so I'm not violating any NDA, so I don't know this for sure, so it's rumor. that DevOps has turned into a single-digit engineering team, and that everyone else has been moved to GitHub Actions. And they hired, at least I know from my area, like a lot of people that I was working with have all joined the mothership, and now they do GitHub Actions or GitHub. So you're going to have some third-party build system or some integrated build system like GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps. All that other setup that we did for identity management, blah, 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 helps us scope what we're going to have to do here for our infrastructure as code and automated deployments, where we're going to need to set up access rights back to those other subscriptions. And it's much easier to manage identity being its own subscription when you have to deploy there with infrastructure as code, instead of trying to have like one master, I control everything account that can just deploy to whatever group it wants. Makes it easier to set these up, but if you're not the one provisioning all the accounts, but it does make it easier to set up and maintain over the long haul. And so that's the whole picture broken down into each individual component. So we looked at each component and the organizational structure. Before we move on to shared resources, are there any questions? All right. Going into shared resources, we're going to look at more in depth the identity, the management, and the connectivity shared resources. You know what? One thing I do want to say as we look at this picture, this is the full picture provided by Microsoft as a standard template. They actually do have, Terraform scripts, and you literally can deploy exactly like this. One thing I would note is that your solution or your team or your whatever is different. So the most recent thing I've set up has its own data subscription, data landing zone that is separate from everything else, because they have so much focus on data that can be shared across different environments that we broke that out into its own subscription. So your application, your domain. Don't think of everything that's not listed here as having to go into that landing zone subscription. You can break it out more broadly than that if you have concerns about access or other components of your application and how you share them. Okay. So for identity, this is what we were looking at. What you need to think about in there is authorization, your platform, and your workload access, which we've talked about, and then your design considerations. So who here knows service principals and managed identities and the difference? All right, we got two. All right. The most basic way to explain it is there's going to be one service principal, and one is a managed identity, and you can think both as system accounts. The only difference being that a service principal, you can add actual users that aren't system accounts to the service principal, and the managed identity, you cannot. Managed identities are purely system accounts. And you want to use those whenever you can, whenever you're setting up resources in Azure, because if no one can log into that account and it's only used by the system, that's much better for securing your resources. So we need to think about, for authorization, we need to think about our access control list, our role-based control, or our attribute-based access control. So in Azure, there's two ways I can secure resources from an access perspective. I can do role-based access control. So I can create a group, and I can assign roles to it saying you've got, you can read logs, you can create service bus, or you can look at, topics and queues, whatever. And I can add those roles to the group or to the individual user, and then they have access to those resources. Another way you can do it is you can do attribute-based access control. So in Azure, components can have tags, and what you can do is you can actually assign it so that if this tag is available, this group has access to this resource based on that tag, and you can propagate it that way. I've never actually done a full attribute-based control, and I really hope I never have to, as it seems a really, really, really complicated way to control it. But I have seen to where there might be investment from the sort of O365 group, and for data management, it may make that where you have more fine-grained control, so that you can propagate, like this document has these access control tags. We propagate it to this blob system in Azure, and now I have proper access control. Maybe, I don't know. I've never had to do attribute-based. I don't want to lie to you on how easy or hard it is, but it looks really difficult. Again, I talked about this earlier, where we have platform and platform and workload access, or your application access. And you really need to think of identity as splitting those two apart. One is Azure, and one is your application. And you need to think about it from with your platform, you're going to have centralized, so you're going to be having to go through Azure Active Directory at some point for your actual authorization. You're going to have shared security boundaries, and it's going to be managed. I should probably change that. So I'm pulling this from Microsoft. They say it's going to be managed by your cloud team, but that's not necessarily true depending on how large your organization is. You could internally have your own management teams on your team, but unless you're like a Fortune 100 and you have a lot of Azure, it'll be primarily managed by the cloud team. We talked about the different environments. You can also think of different managements there as well. So in your development environment or your sandboxes, you don't have to restrict as much. You can actually allow users to add other users, so you can give them the owner role. But you get the idea. And then you're going to use more than likely customized roles for that platform access. Who has log reader? Who can create a database? For your workload, you're going to be using more federated, so each team controlling its own access. You're going to have isolated security boundaries. It's going to be managed by that application team. And you're probably not going to be creating custom roles. You're probably going to be using stuff out of the box, very standardized. For your design, you're going to have to think of hybrid situations. People who've used Red Hat for 15 years moved to Azure. And Red Hat has its own idea of how identity works. VMware is the same way, or any other provider. You'll be in a scenario, if you do this long enough, to where you've got more than 5 identity providers that all need to start working together and do the proper access. So there are hybrid scenarios to consider when you're designing. And the different authentication providers. If they want to use AWS and Azure, they're not going to go all in on authorization through AAD, authentication through AAD. You're probably going to have Okta or some other third party that you have to sign in with. So you need to consider that when you're building this out. How do I make sure that they can actually authenticate to AAD for Azure without having to go through Azure, without having to go through AAD directly? Thinking about your existing LDAP and Active Directory, think about your network design as far as access goes, and then use managed identities, and then think about how third party. So if you're building your access to Azure and they're using something like a hosted SolarWinds or something, how are you managing the access rights to third parties while also securing your own infrastructure? Oh, and also third party, also meaning like how does Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions get access to my system to deploy infrastructure? And that was the picture we looked at earlier. Okay, management. This is what we looked at for management from Microsoft's perspective. What you need to think about is going to be what compliances do I have to be compliant with, how do I track my inventory, and then how do I protect and recover my infrastructure. So for compliance, you're going to have user policies. So you're going, this is the most boring section of the entire design consideration. And if you can do it properly, I get bored talking about it, but it is very important to make sure that this is covered. Compliance is 90% of pre-sales conversations when you move to the cloud, right? Because wherever they already got sign-off for compliance. And now they want to move to Azure, and to get sign-off again is money. And they want to make sure that whatever they're getting into is already compliant. So when we talk about compliance in Azure, Azure has built-in compliance policies and initiatives like HIPAA, right. Yeah. Yes, all of those. So you have to, if you have a compliance, Microsoft most likely already has an environment that is pre-approved via their initiatives that you can apply to your management group that propagate down so that whenever you get audited and they say, well, what can you tell us about your compliance? You can actually use Microsoft's already pre-approved appliance and give it to the auditors. Yes?
It is my understanding, as I said, some of the stuff Azure is offering a lot of it's HIPAA compliant right off the box.
Yes.
Okay.
But they also do have HIPAA-specific initiatives you can do that so that you can say, here you go, and difference for GovCloud and whatever else is required. And someone said SOC 3. We're currently going through something with that right now, and they have something out of the box. But I don't know if we're going to get complete sign-off from the out of the box.
Stuff like FDA compliance.
FDA. You'll have to look. I don't know all the ones off my head, but it was about 5 years ago. This question came up a lot. And they have this whole section of the site now where it's just compliances listed all the way down with links to each one. So FDA, probably. they probably have it because that was a major investment they did to get people out of their data centers into Azure.
But it isn't shared, right? Like they'll do so much and they can monitor for you, but you have responsibilities from your org to be able to maintain that. Like, how do you approve software deployments, right? If you can't be SOC 3 unless you have a handle on that, right? And
Right.
so there's stuff that they can do, but you gotta complete the work.
Yep. It doesn't propagate through because especially things like SOC 3, it's more expansive than your actual hosting environment. So yeah, there's still a process. And but when you're in pre-sales, being able to say that the Azure environment will already be compliant is a huge win for the organization. So you'll have user policies. You want to be able to monitor your configuration drift, which monitoring drift has become one of those like keywords in the industry, like monitor your model drift, monitor your configuration drift. Anyways, you're going to want to be able to do that. You want to be able to make sure that group resources are compliant. You want to examine your existing tools, and you want to consider your business continuity as far as compliance goes. I have done, I'll say I'm on my 5th major migration right now. 10,000 apps, multiple teams, blah, blah, blah. I beg of everyone in this room, if you are in charge of a cloud, please have inventory of what you have in your cloud, where it says things like it runs Java or it's got a database. Please, that's all I ask, is to have an inventory somewhere in your system so that I don't have to go and find every single team that owns something and then find out how many people quit and no team owns it. Please. All right. So for your inventory, you're going to want to see your application-centric platform monitoring. So you're going to want something centralized so that you can look at your entire feed. We have a client right now that wants this to where every single platform, their AWS, their private cloud, their GCP, and Azure all propagate this out. So if you don't even have it at the single cloud layer, you definitely won't be able to do multi-cloud application monitoring. You'll want to make sure that you have that security log for auditing. You want to make sure, so these are all design considerations, you want to make sure that the Azure data retention thresholds and archiving requirements meet your compliance requirements, whether that be internal or for government compliance or whatever it should be called. I forget, like SQL Server, when it first came out as its own offering, had like, I don't know, 7 days or something ridiculous for its backup, and that was it, or it's Postgres, or one of them did. Anyways, that meets nobody's requirements ever. It never has. So you got to make sure that what the Azure data retention out of the box for that product that is managed meets your actual data retention thresholds and your archiving requirements. Also, the inverse. Make sure that what you're archiving, I've had clients that are like, actually, no, we don't want that to be any more than 30 days old, because if it's more than 30 days old and they do an audit, I have to give it to them, so cut everything that's more than 30 days old. You want to make sure that your operational requirements are tracked whenever you're doing this, and please, for the love of God, have a CMDB with the applications in it, because when you reach 10,000 applications and you don't have that, it's just madness.
AWS offers like a scanning tool you can put in your data center that'll like go grab all that for you. Does Azure have
Microsoft's got similar. Yeah. And then somehow, some way, it will show, yes, you have an Azure site, you have an Azure web app, and someone hosted 15 containers in there that runs half the business, and no one knows about it anymore. So it's still great to have that CMDB, at least for the minimum, for me to say who owns this application so that I can go ask them before I start moving their stuff around. You're going to want to make sure that you can, you guys get the idea. So you're going to want to make sure that you have when you're designing, you're not starting from scratch most likely, and there's an entire existing management ecosystem, so consider that. Make sure you understand what is actually critical to the business. If you're going to be managing it and you accidentally think that internal website that just shows error reports versus the manufacturing floor, you're going to want to know. And this is actually something I ran into. We were halfway through migrating a system, had sign-off from the teams and everything, and then they told us, actually, that's on the factory floor, and it runs a machine that's 2 feet away from it, and it has a 5 millisecond latency requirement. I'm like, oh, okay. Just let us know next time prior to shipping it all up to Azure. And then you're going to want your backups, your disaster recovery, and your high availability. Make sure you understand your RTO and RPO requirements. For high availability, understand if you need to have active-passive to meet your SLAs, And when you also need to calculate is how much active and active passive cost. Because this is something that most customers come to us after the sales cycle with Microsoft and they say 99.999. And we're like, You don't understand exactly how expensive that's going to be. That's going to require multi-region failover for every service that you have, and you're going to have to keep both on at all times. So you're probably going to be spending more just moving it to Azure, and now you're asking us to make you spend 2 to 3 times as much. So make sure you understand what is actually required from the business to meet the uptime requirements. And yeah, like I said, you're going to have to understand what multi-region failovers you need. Microsoft's SLA will cover product per region, per availability zone, and you need to figure out exactly how to meet your requirements. And sometimes that requires multi-region failover setups. And understand what your, which one? RPO? Which RPO, because things like Azure Site Recovery, they only have it up to like 4 hours, so you have to make sure that you can meet that, or that satisfies your requirements. Understand how availability zone and sets work. Who understands the difference between availability zones and sets? All right. If you have to describe this to a customer, what I usually say is use availability zones unless the region that you're in doesn't have enough, and then go to availability sets. That's the best way I can describe it. Availability zones means they're not physically co-located. Yeah, they're not physically co-located. So there's a different data center in that region, not in the same place. So that's going to be your availability zone. Your set has more to do with what rack or what, I don't know if you've ever seen it, they put them in like big shipping containers. What shipping container am I in so that this application isn't running on the same power line in the data center, so that it's actually, if there's a failure in an individual instance, it's available on another one. So really what you do is if you need more than they have availability zones, you start using sets. That's really what it comes down to, at least when I architect. Make sure that you can test your backups for whatever backup strategy you have, because if you don't have backups. And make sure that you have network failovers when you have hardline connections or anything from your multi-cloud or private cloud. Oh, and when you start using multi-region or cloud to cloud or whatever, data going out costs money. It costs money. And that will surprise a lot of people when they're like, oh, I'll just run my Spark cluster in the West region and have my blob storage in the East region. And then somehow somebody moved 15 terabytes every night for a month before someone saw the bill. All right, connectivity, what you need to consider when you're designing. We're going to talk about the topology, the connections, and then the security. There's 2 major ways to set up your whole cloud. You can use a virtual WAN or a hub and spoke. And how many people in here would consider themselves a networking expert? Right. I don't think they do that anymore. Like there's some people like, gray hair. They still know how networks work, but really they don't teach that in school anymore from what I can tell. Everyone coming in new doesn't have networking in their, in their repertoire. So for us to discuss this, it's also a little bit outside of mine, but outside of my expertise, but you can use a virtual WAN or hub and spoke. Realistically, you go with virtual WAN if you're the really large organization, you're going to be spanning multiple data centers or regions, and you use hub and spoke for a smaller setup. And you can also think about this as I said, we start going business unit and then application team. This still applies when you're doing your own internal topology. If your team is so large that you actually need a separate vWAN than the major central one, maybe that could happen, but primarily if you're not setting up the entire cloud topology, you'll be working with the hub and spoke, because all you need is that one VNet that you peer off of. And the differences really are, for the vWAN, you're looking at the several regions globally, large networks and large or transitive routing. And then for the hub and spoke, you're limited, it's smaller, you don't need to be as global. And this is the Microsoft diagrams for those. There's vWAN, and there's hub and spoke. All that changes is your connectivity, subscription, and all that changes in that is whether you're using the vWAN or the hub and spoke. This is what your vWAN is going to look like. You will have hub to hubs going across vWANs, so region to region, and then you'll have your express route and your users connecting to either one of those. so that you get the reduced latency in nearest neighbor, so that you're going to the appropriate data center without routing all the way across. And it can get fancy. That was the fancy version. So if you, no one raised their hand when I said the networking thing, but that's neat, and no one here knows what it means. All right. And then for hub and spoke, it's what we're all a little bit more used to, where you probably have an express route to a region, and then each region pairs. And you can do it to where each express route goes to each VPN gateway. Okay. The number one thing, you need to be able to enable private link for your services. If you create a database and you put it on the public internet and you don't get yelled at for it, good luck. You're going to get hacked. I mean, somebody's going to take your stuff. You need to understand that the express route and the VPN have different capabilities. Really, you're talking about bandwidth primarily, but there are other different capabilities. Express route is your have to have if you're doing a hybrid connection. And then your VPN, you can do, a lot of times what we end up doing is the express route requires talking to the ISP, right? Some internet service provider that already has the direct route set up and you're already using them and you got to do a contract. A lot of times for big enterprises, we just set up the VPN to start and then we get the express route in there as well. And you can actually have them in combination after that for different use cases. I don't know enough about express route to really go over the global reach and direct or fast path. Yeah, and then you use your express route as your primary and your VPN as your secondary connections, controlling your ingress and egress, depending on pricing or depending on your data flow of what you need to go through what. And then you want to make sure that you have zone redundancy for those. Finally, security. Think about, and I'm going to go faster because I'm running out of time. Ingress and egress, landing zone network segmentation, your encryption boundaries, and your traffic inspection. So for ingress and egress, you've got a couple of different options. You're going to use Azure Firewall primarily for your internal network to internal network. So you're going to be using that for your private connection back to your other cloud, inspecting that traffic. And then your app gateway and your front door usually go in tandem. You have your front door to protect against like denial of service or whatever else. That's your entry point into the cloud. Behind it, you're going to have your Azure App Gateway. That'll act as your L7 firewall. And then finally, it reaches your application. And you can configure these. I know Front Door Premium now, I think, has the level 7 firewall. And Front Door is like your Cloudflare. You can do your nearest neighbor, special routing, whatever you want to with that. And to make sure you don't get denial of service attacked. You can use third-party solutions, and then you need to understand the difference between a load balancer and a NAT gateway. Zero trust, if anyone doesn't know, zero trust is now a term that is equivalent to web scale for the security industry. So the Microsoft documentation says you need zero trust, and what it means really depends on who you're talking to and what call and what they need to sell you. Zero trust just, to me, means nothing now, but that's what you need, is zero trust. Use network security groups. You can create network security group policies, and then every network security group that sits on a subnet can inherit from the policies. And so you can basically set up one policy to make sure that this is the policy that gets applied to networks that I want SSH across or something like that. Or set up your common logging policies for network security groups because you can log using your network security group for network traffic. Yeah, there you go. You can use flow logs for your network security groups. You can also have them use service tags so they're more easily found, and you can do the policies to tag them to whatever service they're supposed to be protecting. And then ASGs don't span across virtual networks. I don't know, I've been talking for a while. I don't remember what I meant by that, but they don't. You're going to want to define your encryption boundary. This just depends on corporate policy and how much tinfoil they need to wear. So if you have a Kubernetes cluster, do you need encryption once we're past the ingress controller? It's up to you. You just have to define those, talk with security, see what they feel comfortable with, right? When do I terminate my encryption when I'm having that over-the-wire communication? And understand that networks in Azure are software-defined networks. So you will be using the same pipe, tunnel, or whatever you want to call it for your networks. So security probably needs to know that to know, again, how much tinfoil they need to wear to protect that data flowing across that particular network, because it will be shared with other networks. Your VPN can capture network traffic, and the NSG flow logs can be captured across subscriptions. So again, that major shared infrastructure connectivity or management subscription can have NSG flow logs where no one else can see what came through that network security group except the one team that has all the flow logs propagate to it. Okay, so 4 shared resources. We talked about identity, management, and connectivity. And in this talk, we talked about landing zones and shared resources. Are there any questions?
I have a question. It's about private link,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like a real world scenario for me. So, got an app that's running in Azure PaaS, right? Azure web app, and then there's the Azure functions behind it. The functions used to be only event driven, and basically the deployment is using like the I don't know, like the web deploy feature where you can just say, here's my zip file of my artifact, send it on the website is public, so using like their SCM to do that deployment is great. Now we introduce some HTTP functions as well, and more like microservice functions. These HTTP functions, I want to turn on private link. When I turn on private link, I can no longer deploy with SCM because they made it like mutually exclusive.
Yes.
Is there like any workaround that you've seen for that? Because you
I have not.
use it, but then how do you deploy your code unless you put like a build agent now in your VNet? You know.
So how do you deploy? I can answer the how do you deploy. I don't know anything about that workaround. I think for how do you deploy on private link, you still have access to the other deployment options for functions in web apps, which should be FTP or the automatic pickup of your repository kicking off the build pipeline.
It can't reach your repo if it's all private.
It can reach your repo depending on the networking rules you have for it to reach out.
Okay, so you want it to go the other way.
I don't want it. I don't like how they have that feature. I don't want anything from that. I don't like how they designed that feature.
Then you can publish Docker, and you can say, okay, your Docker registry is accessible.
Yeah.
But the function apps in like .NET 6 work differently for Docker than they do for non-Docker, even if you're on Linux. And so you have to run any process out. It's a big pain in the butt that I'm facing.
To all that, yes. Okay. Yes.
A couple things. I think with Azure CLI, you can actually specify the resource group for your Kubernetes infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted it to be in the same resource group as the service, I think you can do it that way, but you can't do it through the portal. Right? The
Correct.
portal will always generate its own crazy named resource group, but I think through the CLI you can. My question was, so we use hub and spoke, right? But we use connection between the VNets instead of VNet peering. Is there any difference really there?
I'd have to research it.
Yeah, okay.
I'm glad I said that whole I don't know networking that well enough yeah. It's still magic, and every time I have to look up what it is, even when I want to just peer, I have to go, which menu do I need to go to and tell the other team? Okay, yeah, sorry. I don't know the difference enough about the VNet connections or peering. It's all voodoo to me.
I have a question about identity.
Yes.
You said there are 2 forms. There's managed identity and service principal.
Yes.
What is the use cases between those two? Like why would you use one over the other?
If I need my web app to access secrets in my key vault, I want to use a managed identity so that no one can log in and get those secrets out.
Just the managed identity has access to it.
Right, and the web app has that managed identity so that it can sign into it and get the keys. Or I want people to be able to sign into the web app itself, and they can use a service principal to sign into that web app. Does that make sense in the different use cases?
Yeah.
Okay. One has to do with users being able to use it, and the other one is no users allowed.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Jared Rhodes. You can find me at those links. Thank you all for coming.